Hi, it's Senator Malcolm Roberts again, and it's Friday's live stream. We're going live on, let me see if I get this right, Facebook, YouTube, and Rumble. I think we're on other platforms, but not live. We won't have time for questions today because, you know what they say about politicians, never keep promises. Well, I've got to break a promise. I told everyone last week that we'd discuss Senate estimates this week. That's not the case because we'll need more than just 15 minutes to discuss Senate estimates. There's quite a lot happened. I've only got 15 minutes today, so I'm going to give you a rundown. I'm actually at 8 Mile Plains Conference Centre in south side of Brisbane. I'm about to give a speech at the Church and State Conference, a wonderful conference, Christians and other people who are welcome to discuss what's happening in our society, not only with regard to church and Christian matters, but also with regard to politics. So that's what I'll be talking on. I've been to Melbourne, the suburb of Box Hill, the council of Box Hill, and we took part in a Senate inquiry into cost of living. We know that's a real problem for people, and the Senate is running an inquiry into cost of living. And then I drove 3.5 hours east to a town called Sale in southeastern Victoria, where we did an inquiry into banks shutting down bank branches, especially in regional Australia. So let me just give you a quick rundown. At the cost of living inquiry, we listened to various people from various groups in the area, organizations as well as individuals. And there were 5 main topics that kept coming up. Rent is a real problem. We knew that. And recently, with the rise in interest rates, mortgages, interest payments are a problem. We know that people are facing high electricity bills, telephone bills. We know that the price of petrol is very high and causing people to suffer. And these people are suffering because they're now making decisions as to whether or not they eat. Not only how much they eat, but the quality of the food they eat. So this is significant impact on children, on elderly, right through the society. So, and the pressures on food, because of food prices, have been more recent. But the other problem, of course, there are 5 main problems, is lack of revenue or income for people. So these things are really putting people under pressure, enormous pressure. So what I want to do is just point out the most obvious thing of all. These bloody problems are largely due to government. Rent is due to government policies, high prices of rent. Bills, especially electricity bills, purely government, absolutely only government, with these artificial restrictions and artificial subsidies that are just raising the price of electricity. Petrol has huge, yes, I'll get to that, Thelma. Petrol has a huge impact on our society. Energy, the primacy of energy means that energy costs, when they go up, go right through the economy, whether it's electricity or whether it's petrol, anything to do with energy, whether it's gas. Energy is used everywhere, so it's effectively a tax, and it's a highly regressive tax, particularly on the poor. So I pointed out through my questions that the real focus of this needs to be on what government has been doing to butcher our economy and to destroy cost of living in this country. We also noticed some people that cost of living has been rising for some time. The lack of affordability or people to look after themselves financially, that's not a good word, is it? The lack of people to have enough income has been rising for some time. But there's been a dramatic change to the system with the COVID restrictions over the last 3 years. That has really gutted our economy. It's gutted small business. It's gutted families, people on injection mandates, inhuman injection mandates. So government is doing a terrible job in this country, state and federal. But then driving out to Sale and quizzing the banks about the bank closures. Let me give you some figures about bank closures. Westpac in 1975 had 777 regional branches. This was 28%, just over a quarter of the Big Four regional network. That number has now shrunk to 186, a 76% cut. Yet the population in Australia has increased 86%. The population's almost doubled, and yet we've had a 3/4 of the branches cut. That's Westpac. We had Westpac there. And looking at National Australia Bank, 1975, the NAB, what a name for a bank, NAB. They want to nab you. Had 760 regional branches in 1975. This was 27% of the Big Four regional network, about a quarter again. That number has gone from 760 to 280, a 63% cut. Yet, as I said, the population has almost doubled in Australia. So, one of the things that I'm very, very reluctant to do is get government involvement in industry and telling companies how to run their businesses and telling companies what to do. There's far too much of it. It destroys initiative. It destroys accountability. But you know, there's no other thing than I can think of with these banks. We had Westpac first yesterday in sale, then we had NAB, then we had 4 local councils and a private, a community group, and also a representative, a delegate from the financial sector union. And they provided wonderful witnesses. But the 2 banks, I'm very reluctant to get involved, as I said, with impacting a business, because it's not our right to. I believe government should stay the hell out of businesses. But these banks, just listen to this. They have an implicit guarantee, the Big Four, only the Big Four, not all the little banks. They have an implicit taxpayer-funded guarantee. The government will bail them out if they get into trouble. And that's what happened in the global financial crisis. Banks around the world got into trouble and we bailed them out. Now there's a bail-in staring at us. They cannot fail. Not only that, but it improves their credit rating, which means they get lower interest rates. They're not allowed to go bankrupt. The taxpayer will stop them. So what you'll find is that because the banks are protected so strongly, there's very little accountability. And then some people might say, well, what about APRA, Australian Prudential Regulatory Agency? What about ASIC, Australian Securities and Investment Commission? Oh, yes, they sound good, but they don't tackle the banks. The banks are a law unto themselves. The second thing the banks get is a term funding facility starting in 2020. $188 billion offered to them at 0.1%, 1/10 of 1%. Commercial rates are 5%. They can lend it out at that, or back to the RBA at 3.35%. Risk-free. That's a money printing machine. So what happens as well, you think about this, the Big Four control, I think 90% of the cash deposits. I may be wrong on that, but it's a huge number. They're growing as a share of that in the COVID restrictions. But the Big Four basically control the market and the governments. And I'm getting tired of this, because when I chaired the Senate Select Inquiry into lending to primary production customers back in 2017, we found the banks were just inhuman in some of their practices, completely callous. I'm not talking about being hard and fair. I'm talking about dishonest and callous. They control the market. They control governments. And so I put that to them. The Australian Banking Association is an association for the Australian banks, largely controlled by the Big Four again. And what about their code, you might say? They've got no provisions for adequately forcing a bank to do something. It's too loosely worded to be enforceable. APRA, as I just said, Australian Prudential Regulatory Agency, and the ASIC, Australian Securities and Investment Commission, have got no teeth. So these banks are a law unto themselves. They're acting as a cartel, and I saw that back in the inquiry in 2017, because their products and their actions, their behaviours are almost identical. The Hayne Royal Commission a few years ago, in fact, Justice Hayne actually asked whether or not they are a cartel. Their dishonesty, the lack of care for customers, and the lack of care for people. Their own people. We heard from the Financial Sector Union delegate that banks are treating their staff terribly. But what else? I'll tell you something else we learned, and that is that the banks have been putting enormous pressure on tellers, right, and people at all levels of the company to convert people onto digital accounts. You know what that means, don't you? Digital currency eventually. What do old people do? What do small businesses do when they want to keep cash on their premises and get rid of the cash on their premises and get it into the bank? So what I raised with them, both the banks and with the local councils, is surely the banks, when they're looked after, protected, risk eliminated, pure profit enabled by the taxpayers, don't the banks have an obligation to serve the community? So they may not make a profit out of a agency or a bank branch, but why shut it? Because you don't go to the bank just to get cash or to deposit cash. You go to the bank for many, many things: loans, advice, services. And if they shut the branch, you can't do that. So that's why the banks, the post office, the local council were once the pillars in communities in regional Australia. So I also floated the idea of a people's bank. That's a pet hobby horse of mine, because the original Commonwealth Bank back in 1911 to 1923, when Denison Miller was its first governor, was the People's Bank. It was a government-run bank, but it was People's Bank, and it provided cheap interest rate loans to small businesses, to trade industries. It drove the early development of our country. The People's Bank is fantastic. And I pointed out to the other senators and some of our witnesses that the State Bank of North Dakota in America is a People's Bank. It's a government bank. And it does the same things that the early Commonwealth Bank did: cheap loans to farmers, cheap loans to small businesses, loans to families. And it is the only bank that has made a profit every year since it started in America. The big banks have fallen over at times and governments bailed them out. North Dakota State Bank is the only one that's made a profit every year, and it's provided these services. So we need to get into public banks, in my view. Also, there were some figures that I used from a paper by Craig Isherwood. I'll see if I can find them here in my notes. Here it is. This was a paper written by Craig Isherwood from the Citizens Party. And I want to thank the Citizens Party for their help and their connections with us. They've helped us a lot. They're a fabulous group of people. Anyway, Craig Isherwood was one of the co-founders many years ago of the Citizens Party. And he wrote an article called "The Australian Precedents for a Hamiltonian Credit System." In that paper, on the second last page, the paper was presented to Federal Cabinet some years ago. These figures: 1 million tonnes of bauxite exported, this was back in the 70s, I think, exported as raw material, earned their country $5 million. Processed into alumina, which is a white powder just before you make aluminium, processed into alumina, it would earn the country $27 million. That's 5 times, just over 5 times as much. And we've got alumina plants in our country. If it's processed from the white powder alumina into aluminium metal, it would earn $125 million. That's 15 times as much. If it's processed into aluminium products made from the metal, it would earn the country and an export income $600 million, which is 120 times as much. Value adding. That's what we need in this country. Reinvestment in manufacturing, reinvestment in value-added processing of not only metals, minerals, but also of foods. And so that's something we need, a People's Bank that will lend to small business and grow it into big business. We have such a huge opportunity. So the banks need community service obligations. We also had a couple of things, I've got to go very soon. We also had a couple of other points that were confirmed. We questioned them about COVID. The Westpac said the pandemic, it's not a pandemic, but Westpac's words, pandemic has encouraged people to move to digital. Westpac confirmed they call it a digital world now. That's what they're pushing. All their tellers have to convert their customers onto digital. NAB confirmed that. The Australian Banking Association conference that I went to last year, in October I think it was, from memory, every single paper mentioned digital currency or digital world, digital transactions. You know, in this country, regional should not mean third world. Regional should not mean third world. But the services in the bush are being decimated. And historically, the banks have been pillars of regional communities. Cash is absolutely vital. It gives us freedom of choice, it gives us protection. The banks have admitted that they have a strategy, the Financial Sectors Union said that the banks have a strategy to remove cash. We know that other organisations have said the same thing. There is a strategy on to remove cash. We stopped the cash ban bill by working with the people and putting pressure on the other politicians in the Labor and Liberal parties. We can do the same with the digital identity and digital currencies. I want to mention just briefly before I finish, I've got to finish and go and prepare for my speech downstairs, that I had the pleasure of having the company of Ricky Lee Tyrrell, One Nation's representative in the upper house of Victoria. What a dynamo she is. And she's marvellous. Very quick, very alert, and doesn't muck around. Just straight to the point. And with her was one of her staff, Warren Pickering, who was a candidate in the upper house last election. Got close, but didn't actually make it in. He's a really bright future. Warren, wonderful man, former armed services, worked in the mines, and very down to earth, and really decent guy. Very quick, very bright. So they were together on Wednesday in Box Hill, suburb of Melbourne, for the for the cost of living inquiry, and then they joined me in the car to Sale and listen to the inquiry into bank branch closures. So I want to give a shout out to Ricky Lee. Victoria's in good hands with her, and also to Warren Pickering. But next week, it'll be Friday. The Senate stops sitting on the Thursday. So hopefully we'll be able to give you an update on Senate estimates, which happened a couple of weeks ago. Until then, look after yourselves, stay free, and we'll see you next week. Thank you for tuning in.